Audiobook Academy. Book Summary. The Fatalist. By Denis Diderot. The story titled The Fatalist may be found in Lermontov's A Hero of Our Time novel. In the novel's final pages, there's a short novella that can stand alone as a standalone. Pechorin is the single link between the other parts of the narrative, which are all unrelated to each other. Bela, Maxim Maximich, Pechorin's diary, and The Fatalist make up the first part of the novel, which is separated into two sections. Pechorin is described by the other characters in the book's first section, but he takes on the role of narrator in the second. As a Byronic anti-hero, Pechorin stands apart from the romantic characters of the time. In spite of his education and fortune, he is a conceited young man who shows little regard for the lives and feelings of others. The idea of friendship itself, to him, is a form of servitude, and hence he cannot bear the responsibility of having friends. Despite being only 25, he believes he has seen and done everything there is to see in life, and as a result, he lives in the moment, with little regard for the repercussions. This outcome is worse than any other for Pechorin. The author Lermontov depicts him as a victim of circumstances, as he comes to hold radically divergent views on the world and ceases to believe in things like love, friendship, or kindness. When we consider Pechorin's acts and personality traits, we see that he is the antithesis of the hero, which is at odds with the book's title. Pechorin's character is shown to be heroic in the final story of this novel, proving the novel's title. Pechorin spends a few weeks gambling and playing cards in a Cossack village in this novel. He initiates a conversation one night about destiny and whether or not it is predetermined or whether or not each person has some control over the course of his or her life. Pechorin bets against a Sergeant Vulich that he will die tonight, convincing him that he will. When Vulich first tries to kill himself, his gun jams. However, when he tries to shoot the hat outside the window, it fires. Vulich was assassinated by a Cossack that night, and his final words were that Pechorin was correct. A fatalist is a person who has faith in the power of coincidences, and the story's title, in a manner, reflects this subject. While he was previously certain that destiny did not exist, Pechorin's opinions began to change after he placed the bet, and he began to question them. Even though he spent his entire life making fun of those who believe in fate, he finally admits to once believing in it for a single second. Pechorin reflects on the possibility of avoiding the accident that led to Vulich's death after the encounter with the drunken Cossack and concludes that it is difficult not to become a fatalist. Though he knows that death is the worst possible conclusion, he cannot help but live his life in fear of the unknown. Pechorin, the main character, recounts the events he witnessed while staying in a Cossack village with the army for 2 weeks and spending every evening playing cards with the soldiers. When they were tired of playing the same games, they had a discussion about their destiny. Muslims believe that every man's life is predetermined by a higher power, and so they launched a discussion about it. There was no shortage of theories, but the most passionate were those in defense of human ability to reason and discern good from wrong, as well as the capacity to accept personal responsibility for one's acts. Those people were attempting to persuade the rest of the group that the idea that destiny exists is unfounded. Serbian military Lieutenant Vulich stood up and emphasized that there is no point arguing about destiny when the only method of determining if it exists is to see for themselves are they capable of directing their own lives. In addition to being a card player and a gambler, this man has chewed alcohol and socializing with others, preferring to remain aloof. No one wanted to accept Pechorin's request since they thought he was strange, but Pechorin agreed anyhow, wagering 20 gold ducats and insisting there is no such thing as fate. It is decided that Vulich would accept the bet, and he gives Major 15 ducats as payment for his services as judge, promising to bring another 5. Others in the room referred to him as a crazed lunatic as he walked out of the room and loaded his gun. When Pechorin informed Vulich he could see the stamp of death all over his face, referring to an old belief that one can see the mark of an impending death on one's face, everyone in the room crowded around the table. Vulich responded to him in an unclear manner, resulting in more bets from the others around them, who were trying to determine whether or not the rifle was loaded. Vulich requested Pechorin to throw a card in the air while he held the gun at his head as the people lost interest. As the card was about to contact the table, he fired a gun, but it misfired, raising the question of whether or not it is loaded. In the end, Vulich opted to shoot at the hat that was hanging from the window and the gun fired, causing the room to fill with smoke and penetrating one of the hats. In the stillness that followed, Vulich began to gather the ducats that had been won. Once again, the topic of gun malfunctions was brought up. There were those who thought the gun hadn't been cleaned correctly, and there were those who thought the gunpowder was damp and replenished. Pechorin was present when Vulich loaded the gun, so he was aware that this was not the case. At this point in the game, it felt better than any card game that Pechorin had played so far, but it was also more risky, as Vulich pointed out to him. Trying to bring up the premonition that Vulich would die tonight, he asked Pechorin if he was now convinced of fate. Pechorin answered in the yes. While Pechorin was pondering his strange reaction to Vulich's comment, Vulich walked away. As more and more individuals leave, Pechorin is dubbed an egoist for gambling with a man who is willing to commit suicide if necessary. As a result, Pechorin spent some time pondering these occurrences, even convinced himself that destiny could exist. He was gazing up at the stars and reflecting on the ancient human idea that the stars held the key to one's future. A realist like him chooses to avoid thinking about the abstract because he is nothing more than a worn-out man with only sad memories and apathy to keep him company. When it came to beliefs, he thought he had already experienced all that mattered in his life, therefore he was bored and decided to abandon them all. He tripped on a slashed-up pig's body. Finally, a couple of Russian thugs arrived, looking for the third Cossack, who was intoxicated and traveling with an accompanying porker. They continued their search for Pechorin when he showed them the carcass of a pig. Nastya's sergeant father, Sergeant Pechorin, had a lovely daughter, therefore Pechorin returned to his rented residence. Nastya was happy to have him, but Pechorin wasn't. The knocks on his window woke him up before he could fall asleep. The three officers were alerted to his knowledge of Vulich's death at the hands of a drunken Cossack who had also just slaughtered a pig. They made jokes about his misfortune and the weird destiny he had just fled. They arrived at the village's far end, where a large crowd had formed around the house where Murder had barricaded himself. When Pechorin saw an elderly woman, he recognized her as the mother of a homicide victim. In the absence of an initial attack, Pechorin peered through the window and saw a murderer lying on the ground beside a bloodied sword with a revolver in his hand. He was pale and holding his head from time to time as he tried to recall what he had done. To prevent the killer from regaining consciousness and killing himself, Pechorin suggested to the army captain that they force their way into the cabin. After a command from the captain of the Cossack unit to surrender, the murderer refused and was shot. While a last resort, Pechorin enlisted the help of a Cossack to distract the would-be assassin as he makes his way through the back window, in the hopes of forcing him to turn himself in while still alive. Pechorin's epaulette was the only part of his body wounded by the murderer's bullet, a uniform shoulder strap. Despite the smoke filling the room, Pechorin managed to seize the hapless assassin and hand him over to the guard. Pechorin was greeted by army officers as soon as the crowd had dispersed. "There's no way against becoming a fatalist," concludes Pechorin, "as we're so readily deceived by our own feelings and sensibility." Aware that he cannot avoid death, he begins to live his life in a more brave manner, not knowing what may happen to him or how he would die. When he later encountered Maxim Maximych, he recounted his encounter with Vulich and inquired about Maximich's views on fate and predestination. It took Pechorin some explaining before Maximych finally got it. Feeling bad for Vulich and calling his death the manifestation of destiny, he agreed with Pechorin's assessment. Vulich, the Russian army lieutenant, who was born in Serbia. A tall, dark-skinned man with a large, but otherwise normal-looking nose. He was a big fan of talking, but he avoided drinking and revealing his thoughts to others. Although he was terrible at gambling, he had a deep love for card games. Interrupting a discussion on predestination, he challenges all in attendance to show how their unique experiences depart from the norm. Pechorin, who doesn't believe in fate, was the target of his gambling addiction. Shooting the gun twice, he misses his first shot since he was aiming at his head, but he hits the second one, confirming that it is in working order. He was slain by an intoxicated Cossack later that night because he started chatting with him. His final words were that, in light of Pechorin's prediction that Vulich would die, he was correct. Pechorin, a 25-year-old Russian military lieutenant. Affluent, well-educated, and enthusiastic, this man is in it for the short term. The fact that he is so young does not deter him from continuing to live a full life out of curiosity and habit. He's a jerk who doesn't care about other people's feelings and enjoys tormenting them, especially ladies. He considers his life to be monotonous, therefore for his own amusement, he attempts to disrupt the lives of others. In this section of the novel, he is depicted as having a fatal impact on the other character. Even though he doesn't believe in destiny, he continues to insult those who do, maintaining solid in his beliefs, even after Vulich showed him the other side. His thoughts turned to destiny after the bet and gun-related occurrences on his trip home. Ultimately, He decides against engaging in abstract thought because his life's experiences have made him less of a dreamer. He deteriorated into a sluggish, and boring man, comparing all of his past sorrows. After correctly forecasting Velich's demise, he comes to the realization that he has no choice but to carry on living his life as though he has no control over the inevitable end. Even though Velich was depicted as a gambler eager to prove the existence of fate, we may see similar traits in Pechorin, who seeks danger and disregards the consequences of his actions. At the very conclusion of the novel, Pechorin sacrifices his life in an attempt to apprehend the murderer, giving no thought to the repercussions. Mikhail Lermontov was a well-known author and novelist whose oeuvre earned him a household name across a wide range of cultures. On October 15, 1814, in Moscow, Mikhail Yuryevich was born. He grew up in an affluent household in Russia, thus his childhood was anything but ordinary. To the extent that his parents came from various ethnic backgrounds, he grew up in a bilingual household. He had a Scottish knight ancestor, and Mikhail is descended from him. In Russia in 1613, George Lermont, a Mikhail ancestor, began his life. Jean, a Frenchman recruited by Mikhail Lermontov's grandmother, worked for Mikhail Lermontov. Because he was raised by a responsible German nanny, having a helper from France was insufficient. He was taken away from his father when he was barely 2 years old since his mother had died. When he was a baby, his grandma became the primary person in charge of his care. Moscow was the graduation city for Lermontov. At the university, he pursued a degree in literature with an emphasis on English. When he was just 14 years old, a lot happened to him. He composed many more poems at that age, thus it wasn't his only effort. He was not only a cadet at the Emperor's School of Cavalry Guards in St. Petersburg, but he was also a student at the Moscow State University. His second major work, Borodino, was dedicated to the triumph over Napoleon, which he achieved while still a cadet. Tsar Nicholas I and his greedy crowd around the crown were blamed by Lermontov of being responsible for Alexander Pushkin's duel and death. Arrested and forced to fight in the Caucasus Mountains, he made an impressive name for himself and returned to St. Petersburg as a hero. Masquerade was written by Lermontov because he was so fed up with the pompous lifestyle of the aristocracy. A duel with a French official resulted in his banishment to the Caucasus, where he remains to this day. A prescient depiction of a duel foreshadowed his own death in July 1841 in his first and only novel, A Hero of Our Time, published in 1839. There is a possibility that this combat was staged by the Tsar's plot to punish another dissident genius. In the works The Dream, Prophet, and The Cliff, he was able to use his fluency in a variety of languages. Rubinstein was motivated by Anton Rubinstein's sacrificial demon to write a lavish opera. Pasternak's mellifluent lines and Nabokov's structural patterns were affected by Lermontov's mellifluent lines. At the age of 26, Mikhail Yuryevich Lermontov died. Thank you for listening in Audiobook Academy. Don't forget to subscribe and smash that like button for more content like this. See you in next video.